get settled, get your drink, get spooky. It's gonna be mad fun today. All right, so I have 1201 here, and I think that's as good a time as any to start. What do you think, Professor?
Let's go for it.
Got this? All right, so ladies and gentlemen, boys and ghouls, hello and welcome. I am Isa, and I am a bookseller at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'll be your ghost for today. And I'd like to welcome you all to a very spooky PNP Live. Thank you for joining us in this virtual format amidst these extraordinary times, throughout all of which we strive to continue to bring you the authors you love and their new books to our politics and prose community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Gothic by Roger Luckhurst on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on a Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we'll try to get to everyone's questions after his presentation, we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. Finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers keeping our business and our spirits afloat. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's fantastic speaker. Roger Luckhurst is a professor in modern and contemporary literature in the Department of English and Humanities at Birkbeck, University of London. His previous works include Zombies, A Cultural History, Corridors, Passages of Modernity, and 2 books for the British Film Institute classic film series on The Shining and Alien. He works on Victorian literature, contemporary literature, Gothic and weird fiction, trauma studies, and speculative and science fiction. Roger is notable for his introductions and editorships to the Oxford World's Classic Series volumes such as Late Victorian Gothic Tales, Dracula, H.P. Lovecraft's Horror Tales, and many others. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Roger Luckhurst to PNP Live.
Thanks so much, Ita. That was puntastic, as we would say here. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen with you now. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. And I'm going to talk for maybe about half an hour and just kind of run through some images. I want to leave lots of time for questions and for responses. And I should say also that I'm in London. It's 5 o'clock. It's October, it's just before Halloween, so the sun is appropriately going to set as I talk, and I'm just hoping that Michael Myers doesn't appear behind me and do anything naughty. And my task, I think, for you is to prep you for your Halloween weekend. So I'm going to give you some useful talking points for scaring all of the people who appear at your door. And pin them to the wall so that you can lecture them about the origins of the Gothic. That's my aim. When Princeton asked me to do this book, they said, we want you to introduce all of the Gothic, that is all the way from 1760s when it first appeared to the present day. So, you know, that's about 270 years. And we want you to do all of it across the whole of the planet. If you could, and could you do that in about 52,000 words? So that was quite a challenge, really. It's really difficult challenge, and that's partly because I think that one of the enduring kind of themes of the Gothic is that we get lost, or people get lost quite fast. They have no sense of direction. Their compass gets broken. They realize that they're in some kind of labyrinth. A house that you can't find your way around, or an actual labyrinth, maybe a forest, a castle. And as we all know from Greek myth, what lies at the center of a labyrinth is usually a monster of some kind, a minotaur. So I was wondering, you know, what's the best way of doing this? I mean, nearly always the Gothic is figured through this idea of being lost. One of the first and most important books in Gothic was by Anne Radcliffe called Romance of the Forest. It launched an absolutely superstar career. So she was someone who was, you know, as big as, I don't know, J.K. Rowling, in the 1790s. All of her books actually are about virtuous young women totally hopelessly lost in forests or in ancient mouldering castles full of menacing monks and nuns and evil Catholics. It's all very kind of frightening, and it's carried on to the present day, this sense of going into the sort of magical forest and getting lost. So you might know that from the Blair Witch Project or from films like Ritual or Pyewacket, a really interesting independent American film, which I'd really recommend. And also just these images of getting lost in the fog, so John Carpenter's Fog there, or that amazing adaptation of Stephen King's The Mist, which came out a few years ago. Again, a sort of sense of these, there are strange things in the fog, but we can't quite get to them. They're obscure, they're difficult. So how on earth are we going to find our way through this genre that is always about, in a sense, getting lost? Well, I ended up thinking that one of the best ways of doing this was literally to take the compass rose, as it's called, and just try and orient my readers north, south, east, and west. The Goths, as we know, come from the north, so that's a good place to start. And then I realized, of course, there is a Southern Gothic as well. And then I started to think about, well, obviously there's Gothic about the East and about the West. So that's how I'm going to present this. And this is one of the chapters of the book. So I thought I'd just give you a taster of how it works. So let's start with the North. We know that the Goths, the tribe that swept down from the Russian steppes all the way down the Danube, it took them a long time, and they were heading inexorably towards Rome. And the sack of Rome by the Goths is often seen as, you know, the fall of the Roman Empire, the end of civilization, or a civilization anyway, and the beginning of what we used to call the Dark Ages. And there are lots and lots of kind of images of this. This is Thomas Cole, the famous American painter. And here we have the Roman Empire at its end, the fall of the empire. And the Goths were kind of associated very early on with supernatural events. They were thought to be able to control the weather. They came with Thessalonian witches who could kind of conjure up all these supernatural powers. They were absolutely inexorable, unstoppable. So there is some kind of force that is coming from the north. And if you know your Game of Thrones, you'll know that winter is coming, and it's always coming from the north beyond the wall that we know. So that sort of image of something horrific coming from the north is very strong and embedded. And of course, we have in European cultures quite a lot of mythology of the north or of Norse. So that kind of Scandinavian whole body of mythology that was written down in the Icelandic sagas in the 13th century and revived by people like Wagner for his Ring Cycle. All of these, you know, majestic, powerful titans of Norse mythology. And we still pick up elements from that mythology as well. I mean, Thor is part of the universe of comics now, but was, of course, a god who investigating the kind of world, encountering all of these giants and huge kind of figures that wander around in Scandinavia. And one of the most famous poems in the English language is Beowulf, which is all about confronting the monster Grendel, who's outside in the thickets beyond the known world. So all of this North mythology is really a kind of central element of our culture. So what happens in the 19th century, and really this is when the Gothic revival starts, and when we name ancient kind of cultures Gothic. This is they didn't call themselves Gothic. This is a term that's began to be used in the early 19th century, and it was particularly associated, of course, with architecture. And so I wanted to talk just briefly about the guy who fixed that down for us, John Ruskin, because he made Gothic architecture essentially part of a northern culture, northern European culture. So Ruskin, who was a very influential art critic, went to Venice as a young man and was completely overwhelmed by this extraordinary space, this kind of floating island, which was full of this amazing architecture. And for him, Venice was a kind of crossing point between the East and West, but also between the North and South. So all of these influences were mixing together. And for him, he could pinpoint, and he was obsessively drawing, as you can see on the left, the quintessential element of Gothic architecture, which is the pointed arch. And he was tracing all of these kind of elements of the pointed arch and this northern architecture. And then he began to sort of suggest that it was essentially an expression of a particular kind of northern culture. So the quote here: strength of will, independence of character, resoluteness of purpose, impatience of undue control, and the individual against destiny, which in northern tribes has opposed itself throughout all ages to languid submission. This sentence goes on a really long time, and he starts from this point to basically massively insult Southern Europe. So this languid place, Italy, France, Spain, these kinds of areas are soft and submissive and alien. And that's why all of those early Gothic novels are set in Spain or Italy, because it's, you know, a space of otherness, a space of suspicion, and of course, a place of an alternative power of the Pope, of Catholicism. So this early kind of Gothic is very much a Protestant mythology, something from the North that is a kind of individualistic expression of a certain culture. Ruskin was very keen on this kind of racial element to the Gothic. Now, where he begins to get this from is it was a really curious sort of story. Where does the Gothic revival start? It starts in this house, which was built by Horace Walpole at Strawberry Hill, which is just outside London. And it's an extraordinary fantasia of a house. That's on the right is the gallery inside. You can still visit this, and it has been actually absolutely beautifully restored. And it is a crazy house that he spent 50 years building, throwing together all of these kind of medieval elements into one weird, strange building full of very kind of odd Gothic architecture. And it was in that house that he was dreaming one night, and a dream turned into a nightmare. And he woke in a kind of state of horror and began to write what became the very first Gothic romance, which was The Castle of Otranto in 1764. So that's one of the kind of origin sources. And this house was incredibly influential. What both Ruskin and Walpole considered was that this was, in a sense, it was a restoration of tradition. It was going back, no longer using Greek classical models, but going back to a much deeper kind of history. It might be associated with horror and terror with the Goths, but actually the Gothic, the medieval cathedral, is this place in which you can embed a kind of culture. And that's why by the time you get to the mid-19th century, when the Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, burns down in the 1830s, it has to be built in Gothic style. So the Gothic revival is really the symbol of the so-called mother of parliaments. So, you know, unlike the Capitol building, which is Greek, here we have a very distinctive revival of a medieval or Gothic architecture. So that's a really kind of crucial element of this story, is that by the middle of the 19th century, the Gothic revival is fully in place. So there's a northernness about this, an association with Northern Europe. But you can go further. And of course, what the compass does is point you to places that perhaps are beyond the known world. I mean, there's some mystery, some magnificence about the fact that compasses always point to the magnetic north. But no one had been there, of course, for no one knew what lay there. There were lots of kind of fantasies about this kind of place. And the far north becomes this place of mystery, particularly again in the 19th century. So just as the Gothic architecture is being built in London, the English Navy, British Navy, send out Franklin to try and investigate the path through bits of Canada and Alaska to find the Northwest Passage to get around the globe that way. And he, of course, famously just simply vanishes. The whole of his crew vanish off the face of the earth, never heard of again from 1845. And this becomes in England a space of mystery and enigma. What on earth happened out there? You might have seen this rather wonderful series that came out last year called The Terror. That's one of the names of the boats, appropriately, that Franklin was trying to find the Northwest Passage in. Nothing was heard of these people for a long time. And 4 or 5 years later, traces of them began to be found. And there was a real concern that actually they might have resorted to so-called survival cannibalism, eating each other. What on earth were civilized English men doing this? And it's still, you know, the sense that we are trying to work out what on earth happened to that expedition. It's thought actually that they were poisoned by their own tins of food, because this was a new technology. It was made out of lead, and they were probably slowly poisoned to death and turned insane, made weird, surreal decisions, and probably had very strong hallucinations as they got lost in this kind of place. So it's an extraordinary kind of story. And the boats themselves were only just found in 2015 and 2016 under the ice. So it's been a very enduring kind of story of the far north. And of course, it leads into some of the classics of Gothic fiction. So, you know, we all know that Frankenstein by Mary Shelley from 1818 actually starts in the Arctic waters, because that's where Victor Frankenstein is chasing his monster. He's moved from the snowy Alps into the depths of the North Arctic polar region. And he tells his story on the boat just as he then leaves into the whiteness to try and find his monster and track him down. And there were other stories told about the North Pole. So The Purple Cloud by M.P. Shiel, rather extraordinary story from 1901, in which a crew do finally reach the North Pole, only unfortunately to unleash a poison gas which kills everyone on the planet except one last man. He's left to roam the ruins of civilization again. And then the first version of The Thing by Howard Hawks came out in the 1940s. Very good black and white film set in the Arctic, about, you know, discovering this flying saucer that is hidden in the Arctic ices, and what they reveal there is this horrific kind of monstrous figure. Now, you might have not seen that one, but seen the later one, The Thing by John Carpenter from 1981. But that is actually set in the Antarctic. And that's partly, I think, because the Antarctic has a much stronger grasp on the American imagination, because it was part of the polar explorations in the 20th century where American teams were very involved in all of that discovery. But again, in English mythology, we have this great story of Robert Scott, who, you know, sent out in 1912 to try and get to the Antarctic, the southern pole first, and of course fails, is beaten by the Norwegian team, and on the way back, as they are disconsolately, you know that they failed, all die in this awful blizzard. The famous Captain Oates, the quintessential Englishman, saying, "I'm just going outside, I may be some time." And it's an essential part of, we love stories of failure here, of heroic failure. It seems to speak to our national character. And Scott is a kind of perfect example of that. You know, someone who tried really, really hard and failed, but died heroically. This is marvelous for English culture. So we're in the South already, in the deep South, and actually it's a place of amazing kind of imaginative reach for American writers. So some of you might know Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, a really strange and unfinished book. It ends literally in whiteness as they get further and further south, this expedition. It's almost as if the unfinished nature of it is a sign that Poe can't imagine what lies beyond except a kind of blank whiteness. It's often invited subsequent writers to kind of come in and try and imagine what might be beyond that far southern point. And one of the most famous of those is H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountain of Madness, a film that, a book that Guillermo del Toro has always wanted to make. He's raised £100 million and then all of the finances has collapsed. So we still don't have that amazing film. But it's a kind of, it's an extraordinary piece of writing that tries to evoke just this horrific discovery that the team find at the Southern Pole. I won't ruin it for you. And it ends up in films like Alien versus Predator, a film I would strongly recommend you never to see because it's terrible, but is set in the Antarctic. And these two clashing mythologies of modern horror cinema, Alien and Predator, kind of come together and run around a lot in the ice cold. But it suggests to us still that even in the 21st century, the kind of Southern Pole is very strong. But in England, in America, sorry, you of course do have a Southern Gothic of your own, and that is associated with the Deep South. The term Southern Gothic was actually first used in the 1930s as a term of abuse. Ellen Glasgow was reviewing a new book by William Faulkner, whoever the hell he was, and was sort of saying, oh, this is just awful, grotesque, blood and bone stuff, she said. Yet more Southern Gothic, I don't like this stuff. And yet from that review, people picked up that term Southern Gothic and felt that it kind of described a whole sensibility which was to do with the aftermath of the Civil War, the legacy of slavery, you know, that great sort of sense of melancholia that lies underneath this kind of culture. And you do get a lot of films that have come since the high point of Southern Gothic in writing, 30s with Faulkner, 50s, and so on. You do get a kind of burst of films in the 70s, so Deliverance and Southern Comfort, which was Walter Hill's film from 1981. Both of those films are about, in a sense, city sophisticates, northerners, who go into the bayou, go into this sort of quintessential southern landscape, and think they have some kind of control over it, some mastery over it. And of course, they discover that actually the awful, strange, mysterious races that exist in the swamp are going to track them down and kill them off one by one. So this amazing kind of mythology of the landscape of the Deep South, I think, is very important. For me, though, and you know, I have written a book on the history of zombies. I discovered that this is really one of the clearest ties to the idea of the South and the Deep South. So, as you might know, the idea of the zombie comes from Haiti. So, you know, south of America into the Caribbean Sea, and it first entered into the culture really through William Seabrook's extraordinary kind of journalistic investigation of Haiti called The Magic Island. And that has a famous chapter in it called Dead Men Walking in Cane Fields. And Seabrook was kind of talking to people about the situation in Haiti and about the plantations that were still going. And someone casually said, oh, of course, you know that the dead work those at night. They're called zombies. And he'd never heard of this term before. He was then told, well, we'll take you tonight. You can go and meet some zombies if you like. And to his utter astonishment, that's exactly what happens. He does meet these people who seem to be stumbling around, not quite alive, not quite dead, working the cane fields at night. And he brings this mythology of the zombie back, writes this bestseller. He was one of the most famous journalists in the 1930s, writes this bestseller. And within a year, it becomes the script for the first American zombie film, which was called White Zombie, with you know, the famous zombie grip, if you've seen the film, and just a bunch of rather inoffensive and rather pitiable zombies who are really just under the control of one master. And that was the kind of first model of the zombie. A very, very evocative film from the 1940s, I Walked with a Zombie, is something it's an extraordinary, poetic, evocative, and truly terrifying, actually, film about a woman who travels to a Caribbean island and sort of is introduced to this culture and this mythology of the zombie, and that's the start of this extraordinary adventure of the zombie. It comes into America through New Orleans and then up and takes over the whole of the culture, so that now something like The Walking Dead is one of the most successful TV series ever made. You know, it's syndicated in over 100 countries. An extraordinary kind of image of moving from a very small kind of cultural moment in the Caribbean into this kind of central trope of the contemporary Gothic. So that's a story that comes from the South up into North America. Very interesting to follow. If you wanted to continue with ideas about the Southern Gothic, I think there are really interesting pathways from, I mean, I would say Absalom is Faulkner's absolutely crucial Southern Gothic novel, a plantation house that in some way is kind of cursed in this family, and the secrets and the ghastly kind of truths of the legacy of the plantations explored in that. Toni Morrison wrote Beloved, which uses the trope of the ghost that returns, that symbolizes all of the African Americans who have been lost during the slave era. And that even comes up to date with a very brilliant book, I think, by Jessamine Ward, Sing Unburied Sing, which came out in 2017. And that again is a very contemporary novel set amongst African Americans in the South, but actually uses again the trope of a ghost. These ghosts that sort of hang around and need to be, in a sense, you need to sing their song, you need to tell their story for them to be able to pass on. And that nearly everyone in that book has this kind of familiar that won't go away. So that's a really powerful contemporary book that I'd really recommend. So quickly, let's think about whether we can go east as well, east and west. It struck me that actually we could do this in stages. So if you know the story of Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, which was published in England in 1886 and became an instant global bestseller, the book is really strange because in a way, I'm going to ruin it for you now, but because Jekyll is Hyde, sorry to ruin the end. But this sort of split personality is actually in the book, split geographically as well. The respectable Dr. Jekyll lives in the West End, in Mayfair, in one of the most respectable kind of places in London, amongst wealthy doctors. But his alter ego, Mr. Hyde, goes out the back door, and it's almost as if he lands in the East End of London, this place that was often thought of as a wilderness of savagery and of primitive kind of slums and awful, monstrous creatures. A book came out in 1890 called In Darkest Africa, and almost immediately it was copied with the title In Darkest England. And this was all about a description of awful things that went on in East London, as if it was the kind of primeval swamp of Africa. So you can do this in London. And then with Bram Stoker's Dracula, which came out just 10 years later, 1897, of course, the tracking of Count Dracula is from the very eastern edges of Europe, so in Transylvania, very eastern edges, and moves steadily and inexorably towards England. He arrives in Whitby in north of England, but then travels down to London. And one of the houses that Count Dracula is found sleeping off his days as he's waiting for his power to return, is in Piccadilly, which is actually as near as possible you can get to Buckingham Palace. In other words, to the center of empire. So you have this insidious kind of Eastern figure who's worked his way right into the center of empire. And that's why this band of brothers come together and have to chase the evil count out of England and chase him back to his castle. I won't ruin the end for you. And you can go further east as well, to Egypt. So there's a whole group of Gothic novels and films about, well, in this case, you know, the mummy and the mummy's curse. But that's very striking that this is it's a sort of imperial fantasy. It doesn't really happen in Gothic literature that you get a mummy's curse until the English army occupy Egypt in 1882. And then very rapidly you get all of these amazing Gothic fantasies of kind of revenge, if you like, of the whole kind of culture revolting against occupation and targeting these either archaeologists who disturbed the grave, or of English travelers who are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. You get a whole museum Gothic as well, because you know there's lots and lots of stories. There is a cursed mummy in the British Museum, which is a great story that I'll maybe talk about if anyone asks. We can go even further to India. And the most obvious person there is Rudyard Kipling, who wrote his early stories were actually in the Gothic and supernatural register. He's a brilliant story writer of ghost stories, and they nearly always take place right on the edge of the known kind of universe, really, beyond the pale, as he himself called it. And this sort of sense of the supernatural is now a language in which you can kind of explore your encounter with the unknown, with the other in the East. And I've put here one of Kipling's fellow writers, Alice Perrin, who was similarly Anglo-Indian, so grew up in India. And she wrote this perfectly titled, for me, East of Suez collection, which came out in 1902. Very good short ghost stories that are worth checking out as well. So you can do all of this east. You can go further east still, into the Far East. So there is a whole kind of Gothic fantasy again from the West about the East. So Lafcadio Hearn, really interesting writer, born in Greece, but moved to America quite early on, wrote journalism in New Orleans. He then went to the West Indies. He's the man actually who used zombie for the first time in the English language. But then he went even further. He went to Japan and never left. He stayed, he changed his name to a Japanese name and married into a family and wrote kind of and collected sort of lots of Chinese ghost stories and Japanese ghost stories. He got very interested in Japanese folklore. So he's a really interesting figure, in contrast to someone like Sax Rohmer, who was the virulently racist writer of the Fu Manchu stories. And the first Fu Manchu film was 1932. The first book was, I think, 1916. But he kept writing those, and this kind of sense of an insidious mastermind from the Far East, Japan or China, somewhere in this kind of region. There is a constant plotting against the power of the West. You do get these famous terms that are called the yellow peril, a name that was actually coined by Kaiser Wilhelm as this kind of warning against the Eastern powers rising up, and that the West needed to come together to defend themselves against this insidious East, always figured in this very racist way as this kind of sense of the tentacles reaching out to try and grab us. So you can go all the way east. The thing I like about this, though, and the thing that I try to do in the book, is sort of say, once you export the Gothic, you can't control it anymore, and actually it comes back at you, and those cultures appropriate and take on the idea of the Gothic and then write it back at you. Perfect example would be Kwaidan, a very influential film from 1964 from Japan. So it kind of sets up the Japanese horror film, really. There were some before, but this was a really major international hit. But actually, it's a retranslation from Lafcadio Hearn's Japanese stories. So in other words, Lafcadio Hearn wrote down stuff that he'd heard in Japan, published it in English, and then Kwaidan retranslates it back into Japanese culture. So you get this kind of amazing transfer of different cultures using the language of the Gothic. So it's becoming a global kind of language. And for us in the West, there are loads of hundreds of films now that are associated with what's sometimes called Asian Gothic or Pan-Asian Gothic. Some of the most scary would be The Ring from 1998, and a similar kind of film, The Grudge. These are, the Japanese tradition of hungry ghosts who are being inserted into narratives that are very familiar from us about curses or haunted houses, bad places that can contain these kind of people who are these ghosts, these vengeful ghosts. And then you also have things like kind of The Host, the exuberant, mad early film by Bong Joon-ho, who also wrote The Parasite, which got the Oscar a couple of years ago. That's about, this amazing kind of monster that sort of jumps all over Seoul. South Korea, a really interesting place where lots and lots of very powerful horror films have been made in the last 20 or 30 years. So worth checking out as well. Let me just spend 2 or 3 minutes thinking about the West, because you might think this is the most tenuous version of this. Is there a Western Gothic? Well, I think there's certainly a kind of Gothic imagination about the West, if you're thinking in terms of America, the frontier and what lies beyond the frontier, the fantasies about what lies beyond the frontier from these early kind of white settlers, these Puritan kind of settlements that want to restart the clock, get away from the fallen world, and to try and envisage, a holy city once more. And yet the whole place is teeming with what they consider to be demonic figures, monstrous threats from beyond. The wilderness itself is ungodly in Puritan thought. You must till the fields. You must plow and sow in order to turn it into godly land. So you get lots and lots of kind of fantasies about, the fearsome scalp hunters of the Native Americans. The first professional writer in America, Charles Brockden Brown, was a Gothic novelist, and some people have argued that actually the American novel itself, all of it, is inherently kind of Gothic. It's bound up in this origin story. And of course, the settlers would often get really focused in on captivity narratives. So the disastrous threats and menaces, particularly to white settler women, that when they are taken into captivity. So there's kind of the initial version of the West is full of horror, but actually by the end of the 19th century, it's much more melancholic. There's a sense in which the West is over in some kind of way. And you have almost tragic, heroic figures like Sitting Bull, who once were, powerful chieftains, but are overcome and end up in sideshows, literally traveling the world with Buffalo Bill, restaging their own kind of lost culture. And that means that, you can do a fusion of Gothic with the Western, so Curse the Undead or Billy the Kid versus Dracula. They're both 1966. But I would argue that Anthony Mann's The Man of the West is quintessentially a Gothic film. It's about the deadness, the undeadness of the West. This is a kind of an ancient, aging cowboy who wants to get away from the past. The past catches up with him. The gang itself is aged and it can't really cope with the modern world. And they have this shootout in a ghost town, perfect kind of staging for, in a sense, a West that is undead. And you see these kind of Gothic images of the West, this dead place in Westworld or in Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, extraordinary vision of the West as this kind of place of Golgotha, really, of death and destruction, coming up again in No Country for Old Men. And then again, you get this same tactic of writing back. So in the last 30 years or so, been really interesting work by native writers, starting with Sherman Alexie, who takes on serial killer kind of tropes and does a version of that through Indian killer, reversing, subverting the whole kind of sense of the Native American as this demonic figure. Someone like Thompson Highway, who is a Cree Indian based in Canada. In The Kiss of the Fur Queen, that's a kind of sexual abuse story, but it's told through that story of the Wendigo. So that kind of native story is being Gothicized and turned into this really helpful kind of narrative that allows you to work through abuse. And then very recently, Stephen Graham Jones, extraordinarily prolific writer, Blackfeet tribe member who uses lots and lots of standard tropes from the Gothic and from horror film in order to again revise and rewrite from the point of view of the native. And a recent film, very gruesome, grim, you have to have quite a strong stomach for Blood Quantum, but you can see that the idea of the Blood Quantum and that tribal membership stuff is being used in a Gothic context by Jeff Barnaby in that film. So that's an interesting but quite strong film, be warned. And then we've got a whole set recently of supernatural westerns. So, Clint Eastwood is involved in these. He quite often plays an undead gunslinger, as he does in High Plains Drifter, as if to suggest, this is just an empty icon. There's a deadness about it that he understands he's playing out. And then The Revenant, very successful film from about 5 years ago. And then smaller films, but really interesting ones like The Wind, which is a supernatural Western as well, that came out very recently. So there's a lot of stuff going on there that I think we can look at and think about as a Gothic West. Okay, so there's your whole compass rose. Let me pull out though, and just think actually you can get beyond the whole planet itself now. And there is this whole thing that sees the planet itself hanging in space as we've seen it since 1968, since this very famous photograph taken from Apollo 8 called Earthrise. This reverse image, and we see suddenly how fragile the whole globe is. And there is a whole different kind of subgenre called cosmic horror, which takes us out into space itself. So, Alien from 1979 is just a haunted house story, but it happens to be set in space, and it happens to use, a horrifying xenomorph, an alien creature that is merciless as it tracks down the crew one after the other. Or even the recent film with Nicolas Cage, so it's going to be crazy, The Color Out of Space, which is an adaptation of this very strong cosmic horror story by H.P. Lovecraft. So suddenly now we've gone planetary, and the dread has engulfed not just north, south, east, or west, but actually the whole planet. So there's my quick guide for you. I'm really, really happy to answer any questions at all. I'm going to hand over to Isa to manage all of that, but anything you want to ask at all, anything, I'd be really happy to answer. Thank you so much for listening.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Roger, for that super insightful, amazing talk. It was incredibly fascinating, and we'll try to get to all of the questions. We have a few here, and I think they're great. So we're going to start off with one from Julia, who asks, Hello, all. We've seen a lot of movements when it comes to Gothic-inspired architecture and interior design. Lately, there's been a trend towards minimalism and where'd it go? A trend towards minimalism that turns away from what we might consider intricate or ornate, lavish, highly decorous, etc., and also plenty of counter movements, sort of like cottagecore. So can you talk about like what may be behind some of these trends? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Yeah, I think these things all come in phases, don't they? So you do get kind of moments of really real interest in kind of Gothic revival. So, you know, anytime anyone declares it dead, it will always stumble back like a zombie. It's, you know, it's an undead kind of style. And I was just reading yesterday about a kind of Gothic dark academia kind of style, which is really big on TikTok apparently. And that sort of, you know, that sense of it, well, it's still around. So people might talk about minimalism and, you know, cherishing your objects and thanking them and then throwing them away. And that seemed to kind of come in for a while. And that seems to be profoundly anti-Gothic, I think. But on the other hand, you know, I think with all of us having been in lockdown, what you tend to want to do, I think, is kind of clutter and to protect yourself in these kinds of spaces that are that feel suddenly quite vulnerable. So I think I've seen kind of quite a lot of, you know, interest in those sorts of very, very kind of cluttered, dense, angular, dark kind of interest. So I think there are always kind of movements, counter movements. Whenever you have, I mean, I live in a minimalist house, but also, you know, it's entirely stuffed with Gothic books. So, you know, you can live this contradiction as I do.
I mean, I guess that's kind of true. Like I do recall you mentioning Parasite, and that was a lot of like very empty space, very angular until you get to the bottom, but I won't spoil it for everyone who hasn't seen it. But that's awesome. I have another question from an anonymous attendee. You mentioned in your introduction to the book that the Gothic has provided a space for expression of female desire. So extending that a little, I'd like to know your thoughts on why perhaps marginalized identities have found expression in Gothic horror or in Gothic horror tropes and that sort of imagery.
Yeah, great question as well. I think it's worth bearing in mind that the Gothic, right from the start, was considered to be, you know, a slightly kind of well, not dangerous, but potentially it could lead readers astray. And there was a very kind of clearly coded sense here that too many women were reading them, and too many women actually were writing them, because the predominance in the 18th century is actually for women writers. So Anne Radcliffe was the superstar here. Horace Walpole might have started it, but he was an eccentric weirdo. You know, no one was kind of interested in what he was doing. But Anne Radcliffe, you know, kind of absolutely sold this. So you get loads of people, Clara Reeve and Charlotte Dacre, Maria Edgeworth, all these kind of early kind of Gothic writers. And that happens all the way through the 19th century as well. So really the classic ghost stories are by women writers, if you think about it. You know, Margaret Oliphant, someone like George Eliot actually attacked all this stuff as silly, but then wrote a fantastic ghost story herself. You know, The Lifted Veil is an amazing kind of ghost story, really. And then Edith Wharton, Vernon Lee, all these kind of great writers, May Sinclair, loads of people who were writing that. So it's obvious that in a way it becomes a place for, the more it's not respected, in the sense people go, great, there's a place where I can put some interesting kind of ideas. You know, something like The Yellow Wallpaper, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a brilliant kind of writing back to her useless doctor who'd actually driven her mad rather than curing her. You know, and it's an amazing kind of piece of expression of female rage in a really kind of polite, wonderful kind of way that slowly drives you mad as a reader in the similar sort of way. And you can see how people have picked up on that. People of color, writers of color, have picked up on that recently as well. So Victor Laval has written back to H.P. Lovecraft, that you know, horrific kind of racist element of Lovecraft. Great, what Victor Laval says, an African-American writer, I'm going to take your story, I'm going to appropriate it, subvert it. Exactly like Lovecraft Country.
Awesome, that's great. Yeah, I do love that sort of like trying to find expression in these like darker spaces. Okay, I'm gonna group a bunch of like some other questions together. So we have Linda Bakula's question, who brings it back to you and asks, what Gothic writers do you most enjoy reading? What qualities of their storytelling make them your favorite? And I guess to expand that, an anonymous attendee also asks, like, if you're new to the genre, what good contemporary author would you recommend to start with this journey?
Okay, yeah, that's really good question, I think, and I will try and think of a good response to that, because I feel very responsible. If you're new to the genre, I don't want to put you off. I mean, Gothic writers that I really enjoy, I think, are ones that are they don't go for the full-on kind of explicit attack on you and on your senses, but actually are very kind of insidious and suggestive, and they slowly creep up on you. So those sorts of things are really good. And I quite like things like, so Jekyll and Hyde is a good place to start, because if you probably know the film version of that, you know the myth, but the story itself is really curious. It's told back to front. So that you get a series of people who are quite kind of concerned about this Mr. Jekyll down the road. You know, he's a respectable guy, but he seems to be involved with this strange man who keeps coming out of his back door. And you know, what's he got on him? What's this relationship between these two people? And it's only slowly as these texts get put together that you realize what the truth is. And I like stories like that, so suggestive and evasive ones. If you want to go into it via if you like, safe literary writers, someone like Henry James was obsessed with ghost stories, and he wrote some very, very good ones, but they are subtle and strange and unnerving, and sometimes you have no idea what just happened. So famously, Turn of the Screw would be a good place to start. So that's, you know, that's a really good old-fashioned ghost story, or is it? You know, and you know, you're left in a kind of sense of, well, is the governess fantasizing seeing all of these ghosts? Is it a psychological state, or is it actually happening? You know, and you're kind of left in this state of suspension. So much so that H.G. Wells, when he read it, he was so enraged by it that he got on his bicycle and went round to Henry James's house and said, "What's this about?" He was completely enraged. You know, that sort of stuff's good. The thing that the story of his that really freaks me out is the Jolly Corner. Set in New York, and I would recommend that. A man who inherits a house and then starts to wander around the house, and bad things happen, I think. So if you know, that's a good entry point. You know, so it's really kind of sophisticated, but actually it's giving you a chill at the same time. Someone like M.R. James would also be really good for that. His stories are short. You know, you can move on if you don't like them. But he's a really kind of good place to start as well. A kind of very eccentric Cambridge Don who wrote stories to read out to his fellow Dons.
Oh wow, awesome! Well, thank you for that bit of literary gossip as well. I just imagined like Jewel's or Skinny Bites. But okay, I have another question, sort of related to the earlier question just asked about like what qualities of Gothic storytelling make them your favorite, but appealing to like the broader audience of people who read, like, why do you think people seek out jump scares in the books that you've mentioned? Like, what is it about being scared that like appeals to us as like?
Yeah, that's the foundational question, I think, isn't it, of why the hell we do this. This is what I teach a Gothic course to my students every year, and kind of say, what the hell are you doing here? You know, it's like I should give you a trigger warning every minute. You know, it's like, why do you want to indulge in this? And that's the kind of central question. I think there are lots of different answers. Someone like Stephen King says that basically it's a kind of safe place. Oddly, it's a secure place where you know the conventions of the genre. You can indulge your anxiety and your fear in a sort of safe place. And as always in Stephen King, there's a kind of restoration of security at the end. You know, he calls his fiction consolatory. You know, it's giving you sort of comfort in a way. So maybe there's a ritual here about exposing ourselves to danger, and nevertheless, you know, wanting to kind of explore that in a way that that scares us, but we know is safe at the same time. So in a world that's really kind of truly sort of terrifying and uncertain, as it always is, you almost have this perverse pleasure in just saying, right, I'm going to go here, I'm going to watch this, because I know that in 90 minutes I'll be okay.
Great. All right. Well, I have one last fun audience question. And again, I apologize to everyone whose questions we didn't get to. We're running a bit short on time here, but one anonymous attendee would like to ask, I'd like to know more about the cursed mummy in the British Museum that you mentioned. So please do enlighten us.
Right, yeah, good. I'm sure you've got an extra 4 days, so I can talk about this for a very long time. I mean, I wrote a book called The Mummy's Curse, which was about the British Museum mummy. So, I mean, the short version of this is that a man called Thomas Douglas Murray bought a mummy case, so like a coffin lid, in the 1860s. And this was illegal, but he bought it, and then he promptly went shooting and shot his own arm off by mistake. And it became kind of a legend that, he, being a Victorian gentleman, he just simply tied it with a tourniquet and just walked home. But he was, from that point, he was the man who was marked, literally the one-armed man, marked with a curse. And it was eventually given this mummy lid to the British Museum. It's still there. It's known as the unlucky mummy, and it's item 22542. And you can go and say hello to it. It's associated with all kinds of stories and rumors, including that the British Museum had sold it, so they were sending it out to America on a boat called the Titanic. But of course it was made out of wood, so it floated, and it was sent back to England on the Lusitania, which sank with the loss of 1,500 lives. And then it was sold to the Kaiser of Germany in 1914. So, this sense of the kind of endless proliferation of these kind of, it's all setting up Tutankhamun and the Mummy's Curse in the 1920s. It's the story that starts all of that story of the curse.
Oh, that's awesome. There's kind of like some blood diamond stuff going on.
Oh,
sorry, not
definitely.
blood. Hope. There's some hope diamond.
Yeah,
yes.
The hope diamond, yeah.
I do love a cursed museum object, but unfortunately, everyone, we do have to wrap up. And before we go, Roger, since this is a bookstore, I would like to ask you what you're currently reading and what you'd like to suggest for our audience.
Okay, well, I'm currently reading a really great Gothic novel by, I should say, a friend of mine, Victoria Nelson, she is from California. It's a great Californian Gothic novel. It's called Neighbor George, and it's set in California, and very, very spooky and weird things happen. I'm really enjoying it. I'm going to be interviewing her about her book next week, so that's why I'm prepping. I'm going to have your job next week.
Awesome.
So there's that. So I'm reading that, but I tend to go back to something like M.R. James at Halloween, just read one story, just a short kind of thing on Halloween itself. So that's what I'm going to be doing.
That's fine. Halloween's in a few days. I hope everyone is getting spooky. But yeah, so thank you so much, Roger, for that amazing lecture. I wish you could spend so much more time with us talking spooky stuff. It's been such a pleasure having you. Thank you everyone for coming to this talk. Thank you for joining us at whatever time zone you're at. And just don't forget, your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this. And we cannot continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. And you can do that by using the link in the chat to purchase Roger's superb book, Gothic. It is here, it is full color, it is beautiful. Check our website for the most up-to-date event listings, as well as we have an amazing list to choose from. And thank you so much again for your time, for your insight, for your knowledge, for your curse knowledge. Amazing. And for everyone else, we hope to see you all soon. And thank you once again for joining us today. So stay safe, stay spooky, and stay well read, everyone. Have a great Halloween. Don't get haunted, and we will see